What if everything you thought you knew about this situation was flipped in one single sentence, live, on camera? Because that's exactly what happened when Candace Owens said something no one expected. Tyler was the scapegoat. That line hit instantly, no buildup, no warning, just dropped into the middle of a conversation, and suddenly everything felt different. But then something changed. People started asking why she said it, what she meant, and who it was really about. And this is where it gets strange. Because if Tyler wasn't the real focus, then who was? And what was actually being covered up? To understand why that one sentence hit so hard, you have to look at what was already happening before Candace Owens said it. Because this situation wasn't calm. It wasn't settled. It was already full of tension, unanswered questions, and shifting narratives. Tyler had been at the center of the conversation for a while. Not loudly at first, but consistently. His name kept coming up whenever things got complicated, whenever something didn't make sense, whenever people were looking for a reason behind certain events. And over time, that focus stuck. It became the default explanation. But then something changed. Candace challenged it, not with a long explanation, not with a detailed breakdown, just one line that completely disrupted the narrative. Tyler was the scapegoat. And that's where everything flipped. Because now, instead of asking, what did Tyler do? People started asking, why was Tyler blamed? And this is where it gets strange. That shift didn't just change the focus, it exposed a gap between what people thought they understood and what might actually be happening behind the scenes. But here's the problem. No one had the full picture, just fragments, pieces of conversations, moments that didn't fully connect. And now, that one sentence forced all of those pieces back into question. Because if Tyler wasn't the real issue, then something else was. And that something else, that's where Erika's name started coming back into focus. Not as background, not as secondary, but as central. And once that shift happened, everything started unraveling fast. It happened in the middle of a live conversation. No dramatic buildup, no warning, just a shift in tone. Candace Owens was already speaking about accountability, about how narratives form when situations get complicated. At first, it sounded like general commentary, something broad, something you could apply to almost anything. But then something changed. She paused, just for a second, and when she spoke again, her voice was sharper, more direct. That's when she said it. Tyler was the scapegoat. And instantly, everything stopped, because that line didn't just add to the conversation, it redirected it. Completely. And this is where it gets strange. She didn't explain it right away. No follow-up, no immediate clarification. She just kept talking, as if what she said didn't need explanation. But here's the problem. It absolutely did, because now that one sentence created a chain reaction. If Tyler was the scapegoat, then there had to be something he was being blamed for. And if he was being blamed unfairly, then someone else was responsible. And that's where things started falling apart, because now people weren't focused on Tyler anymore. They were looking past him, trying to figure out who or what was actually behind everything. And it doesn't stop there. Within minutes, clips of that moment started spreading. Short edits, just that one line, over and over again. Tyler was the scapegoat. And each time it was replayed, it hit harder, because the more people heard it, the more questions it raised. But then something changed again. People started analyzing the rest of what she said before and after that moment, looking for context, looking for clues. And that's when they noticed something subtle. She mentioned misdirection, not directly tied to Tyler, but close enough. Close enough that it felt connected. And suddenly, the story got bigger. Because now, it wasn't just about blame, it was about intention. Who was being blamed, and why? But here's where the tension really started building. Because Erika's name started coming up again, not because Candace said it directly, but because people connected the dots. They looked at past moments, past interactions, past situations where things didn't fully make sense, and weirdly, Erika kept appearing in those connections. Not clearly, not definitively, but consistently. And once people saw that, they couldn't unsee it, Because now the narrative had shifted from Tyler being the center to Tyler being the cover. And that's a completely different story. Because if someone is a scapegoat, then the real story is somewhere else, hidden, behind what people are being shown. And that's what made this moment so powerful, because it didn't give answers. It created a new question. Who was the real focus? And that question, it spread fast. Because now, people weren't just watching the clip. They were rewatching everything. Every past detail, every conversation, every moment that felt slightly off, trying to find what they missed, trying to understand what Candace was pointing at, without saying it directly. And just when it seemed like the speculation couldn't go any further, another piece surfaced. And this one, it didn't just raise more questions, it made everything feel a lot more intentional. The next piece didn't come from Candace directly. It came from people rewatching everything that led up to that moment. And that's when things started lining up in a way no one expected. Because once you remove Tyler from the center of the story, the entire timeline looks different. And this is where it gets strange. Moments that didn't make sense before, now they did. Old clips, past reactions, small details that were ignored at the time, they suddenly felt important. Because now, people weren't asking, what did Tyler do? They were asking, what was happening around Tyler? And that shift, it changed everything. But here's the problem. When people started mapping that timeline, one name kept showing up in the background. Erika, not directly involved in every moment, but present enough to be noticed. And that consistency, it raised questions. And it doesn't stop there. A clip resurfaced, older, but now incredibly relevant. In it, Candace Owens is talking about how sometimes the loudest narrative is the least accurate one. At the time, it sounded like general advice. Now, it felt like context, because suddenly, the idea that Tyler was the focus looked like part of that loud narrative. And that's when things started falling apart even faster, because people began connecting patterns. When Tyler's name was trending, what else was happening? When attention was focused on him, what wasn't being discussed? And weirdly, there were gaps, moments where other developments seemed to disappear from the conversation entirely. And that's when the word scapegoat started to feel less like an opinion and more like a strategy. But then something changed again. A comment surfaced from someone who had been following the situation closely. They wrote, "People are looking at the wrong layer." That line spread fast, because now it added another dimension. The idea that what everyone was seeing was only the surface, and that beneath it, something else was happening. But what? That's the question that took over everything. Because if Tyler wasn't the real focus, then who was? And why was the attention placed on him so heavily? And this is where the tension really escalated. Because now, Erika wasn't just part of the background anymore, she was part of the question. Not because of a direct accusation, but because of proximity, timing, patterns that people couldn't ignore. And that's what made it intense. Because now the story wasn't just shifting, it was widening, pulling in more details, more moments, more connections. But the biggest twist? Still no direct explanation? Candace hadn't clarified what she meant. Tyler hadn't responded. Erika hadn't addressed anything. And that silence, it made everything louder. Because now, every piece of information felt incomplete, like it was pointing somewhere, but not fully revealing it. And that's what kept people watching. Because the more they looked, the more it felt like something bigger was just out of reach. And just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any more complex, another detail surfaced. And this time, it didn't just suggest misdirection, it hinted at something much more deliberate. The next detail didn't come from a clip. It came from a shift in how people started interpreting everything. Because once the idea of a scapegoat took hold, people stopped looking at individual moments. They started looking at patterns. And that's when everything got more intense. And this is where it gets strange. Someone put together a timeline. Not just random events, but specific moments where Tyler's name became the center of attention. And right next to those moments, other things were happening. quietly. Less visible, but significant. And once people saw that side by side, it didn't look accidental anymore. It looked like attention was being directed. But here's the problem. No one could prove it. There was no document, no confirmation, just alignment. But sometimes, alignment is enough to raise serious questions. And it doesn't stop there. A second layer appeared. People noticed that whenever Tyler was being discussed heavily, certain conversations disappeared. Topics that had been gaining traction suddenly dropped, shifted, replaced, and that pattern, it kept repeating. And that's when things started falling apart in a bigger way. Because now, the idea of a scapegoat wasn't just about blame, it was about distraction, what people were being shown versus what they weren't. But then something changed again. Another clip surfaced, not from the main conversation, from a smaller discussion where Candace Owens talked about controlled narratives. She said, "When people are given one story loudly enough, they stop looking for the others." That line hit hard, because now it felt like she wasn't just commenting, she was explaining. And suddenly, everything connected. The focus on Tyler, the gaps in the timeline, the way attention shifted at specific moments, it all pointed in one direction. But here's where the tension really peaked. Because now people weren't just questioning what happened, they were questioning how it was presented. And that's a much bigger issue. Because if a narrative is being controlled, then the truth isn't just hidden, it's replaced. And that's what made this situation feel serious. Because now the question wasn't just, who is responsible? It was, what are we not seeing? And that question, it spread fast. Because once people start looking beyond the obvious, they start finding things they didn't expect. And that's exactly what happened. More moments resurfaced, more clips, more inconsistencies, all pointing to the same idea, that something didn't fully add up. And that's when everything reached its peak tension. Because now, the story wasn't just about Tyler or Erika. It was about the structure of the narrative itself, how it was built, how it was maintained, and why it was never fully explained. And right in the middle of all that, silence. No direct answers, no clear breakdown, just fragments, hints, and a growing sense that something bigger was being kept just out of reach. And just when it felt like the situation couldn't get more intense, it did. Because now, it wasn't just observers connecting dots. People closer to the situation started reacting. And that's when everything escalated. And that's when everything stopped feeling like theory and started looking like something real was breaking through. Because now, it wasn't just viewers connecting dots. It was people closer to the situation reacting. Subtly at first, but noticeably. And this is where it gets strange. A few individuals who had previously spoken about Tyler went quiet, not gradually, suddenly, no follow-ups, no clarifications, just silence. And in a situation like this, silence says a lot. But here's the problem. At the same time, those voices disappeared. New ones appeared. Not directly addressing the situation, but hinting at it, talking about misdirection, about how narratives are shaped. And those comments, they lined up perfectly with what Candace Owens had already said. And that alignment, it raised the stakes instantly, because now it didn't feel like one opinion. It felt like multiple people pointing in the same direction. And it doesn't stop there. A post surfaced from someone who had been involved in earlier discussions around Tyler. They wrote, "The more you look, the less it makes sense." That line spread fast because it captured exactly what people were feeling. The deeper they went, the more complicated everything became. And that's when things started falling apart even faster. Because now, people weren't just analyzing clips. They were analyzing reactions. Who spoke, who didn't, who changed their tone, who avoided the topic completely, and patterns started appearing again. But then something changed. Erika finally reacted, not directly addressing Candace, not mentioning Tyler, just a short statement. She said, "People love to create stories when they don't understand the full picture." That line hit hard, Because now it wasn't silence anymore, it was pushback, but it was still indirect, and that made everything more intense. Because now people had something to interpret. And they did. Some saw it as a denial, others saw it as avoidance. And that division, it made the story even bigger. Because now, it wasn't just about what happened. It was about how people chose to see it. And this is where the tension reached its peak. Because now, all the pieces were on the table. Candace's statement, the timeline patterns, the resurfaced clips, the silence, the reactions. And still, no clear answer. And that's what made it worse. Because now the question wasn't just what's true, it was, why isn't anything being explained clearly? And that question, it kept growing. Because the longer it went unanswered, the more serious it felt. And then, the biggest twist hit. Not another reaction, not another hint, something deeper. Something that didn't just add to the story, it reframed it completely. And if what people are saying about it is true, then everything we've seen so far might not mean what we think it does. And then, the part that changed everything finally came into focus. Not through a dramatic confession, not through a direct statement, but through context, real context. Because once people stepped back and looked at everything together, a different picture started to form. And this is where it gets strange. The scapegoat line from Candace Owens wasn't pointing to a hidden person, it was pointing to a broken narrative. Because when you look closely, Tyler wasn't just being blamed, he was being used as a focal point, a way to simplify something that was actually much more complicated. But here's the problem. The situation itself wasn't as clean as people wanted it to be. Multiple factors, multiple moments, different interpretations layered on top of each other. And instead of unpacking all of that complexity, everything got condensed into one name, Tyler. And that's what made him the scapegoat. Not because there was one clear truth being hidden, but because there were too many pieces to explain easily, and it doesn't stop there. Once that idea clicked, everything else started making sense. The gaps in the timeline, the shifting attention, the way conversations kept redirecting. It wasn't necessarily a coordinated distraction, it was simplification, a way for people to make sense of something messy. And that's the reveal. Not that there was one hidden culprit, but that the story itself was never as simple as it was being told. And once people tried to force it into a simple narrative, something had to take the weight of that story. And that something was Tyler. And if that's true, then the biggest misunderstanding wasn't about who was responsible. It was about how the entire situation was being framed from the beginning. When you step back and look at everything together, the statement, the reactions, the timeline, and how the narrative evolved, it stops being about one person. It becomes about how people process complicated situations. Because what this really shows isn't just about Candace Owens, Erika, or Tyler. It's about simplification, the human instinct to take something complex and turn it into something easy to understand. One name, one explanation, one reason. And this is where it hits deeper. When something doesn't make sense right away, people don't wait. They fill in the gaps. They build a version that feels complete, even if it isn't fully accurate. And that's exactly what happened here. Tyler became the center, not because everything pointed to him, but because it was easier for everything to point somewhere. And once that happens, it's hard to undo. Because narratives stick, even when new context appears, even when things don't fully add up. And that's what makes this situation so powerful. Not just what was said, but how quickly people built meaning around it. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Not just who was involved, but how fast the story formed, and how hard it is to break once it does. So now it all comes down to one question. Was Tyler ever really the focus, or was he just the easiest way to make sense of something much more complicated? Because if one line can shift an entire narrative, what else have we misunderstood just because it was simpler to believe? Drop your thoughts below. Do you think this was a misunderstanding, Or is there still something deeper we're not seeing? And if you want more deep dives like this, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes, the biggest stories aren't about what's hidden. They're about how we choose to interpret what's right in front of us.